We have Adam here who's going to introduce himself here in just a second. But today I want to talk about barndominiums, which for those of you who don't know, are basically metal structures. And Adam, we can share kind of a definition, his definition here in a second. But, traditionally were originally like kind of agricultural metal shop buildings that were then finished on the inside. That turn into living spaces. And there's lots of reasons why, but I know that people who are interested in simple living and even tiny homes in some cases are looking at this as an affordable way to build a home. So Adam, you want to kind of kick us off, introduce yourself and who you are and why we have you on the show here today?
I don't know why you have me on, but
some guy I found on the internet.
My name's Adam Carter. I am a video producer by trade, but we also built a house, and barndominiums was something that we really, really heavily looked into and spent a lot of research on. And so Ryan reached out and said, "Hey, I would love to talk to you about barndominiums and why they'd be good or bad." But we've got a YouTube channel at Hurley Films, HEARLYFILMS is our YouTube channel. We go step by step through building the entire house, as well as some fishing videos and homesteading and family vlogs and all kinds of other fun things. So that's pretty much all we do.
Okay. Yeah. And so for some background, kind of my interest in barndominiums is I considered very strongly building a barndominium style home on a piece of acreage that I own up in the mountains. This would be like in addition to my tiny home that I have in like kind of central North Carolina. And we'll get into this about your opinions of the looks and the aesthetics of these things.
Yeah.
Like some people are really into them. Some people are not.
Yeah.
I kind of like it. And I think actually one of the bigger things for me is that the cladding, the maintenance, ease of maintenance on these things is pretty low. Yeah. So yeah, for me, I consider that very strongly. And to some extent, I still plan to do kind of I'm definitely doing a shop, but with a smaller kind of finished area. So, Adam, I kind of gave my definition earlier, but what is a barndominium? How would you define it?
Yeah.
Anything
I would say, a barndominium at its core, at its most root level, is purely utilitarian. It is combining two structures into one to save money. And that's the point of a barndominium. And if you got a different definition, I'd love to hear it, whoever that person is, because I'd need a lot of convincing to change mine, because it really is like you talked when I touched on the aesthetics. They're not necessarily the most cool looking house. It's a big box that's made of metal. It's not super awesome, because at some point, if you get away from that to try to make it cool looking by adding like the little juts and the little columns and the little gables and all that stuff, well, at that point, you just added a ton of money. And so your utilitarian purposes just kind of, you threw them out the window to look cool, which is fine. To each their own. You don't want to have a stupid looking house, but at the same time, something that may look not as great when you realize that you built it for an incredibly low cost, you give and you take, and you find yourself at that place. But so, ultimately, at the end of the day, for me, it is that utilitarian aspect that you're combining these two structures into one to give you that shop, barn, garage, whatever, as well as an additional living space, so you can actually function as a family or as a person or whatever. Yeah.
And I think I'd like to talk a little bit about here is the reasons why these are so affordable is, one, they're typically simple in form and shape, right?
Yes.
Every single time you add a corner to a house, right, the price goes up. Unless you have a triangle house, you're going to have four corners. So your most affordable, simplest house is going to be a four corner thing. The second that you start to add, and I've seen these barndominiums where they're like these gables and these offshoots and these bump outs and all, like 14 porches and like a portico and all this stuff. And I'm like, dang, that's getting very, very expensive.
Yeah. I mean, in that point, like I look at those because there's a fine line. Like I draw a distinction between a house that was built with metal studs and metal siding and a barndominium. They're two different things, in my opinion, that because one of them, like a barndominium to me is that utilitarian. You're literally the nature of the word barndominium itself is a combination of two words. It's a condominium mixed with the barn, like smash it together, boom, you're done. It's like there's that aspect to it. And like you said, every bump out you add, every cupola, like so the cupolas, the fancy thing that sits on top that's got like the wind vane and the little windows, it serves no purpose.
Right.
Even on the old barns where they actually served the purpose, they were for ventilation. That's it. That was all the purpose that they were for. And so those themselves, when we were looking at barndominiums, just to add a little bit of, a little flavor to the barndominium itself, those stupid cupolas were like $1,200 a piece. And that's just them taking this thing and going, just sticking it on the top of the roof. We were like, oh, those look really cool. Never mind. No, they don't. They don't look.
Yeah. And I think there are a few things that you can do that are relatively affordable that take it from just a plain old box to add a little bit. Like I've seen where they've basically extended the roof, like the same roof line, the exact, it's just a hip roof. They extend it and it has like a front porch, but the lines are the same. They just basically end the wall a little bit. And then sometimes they'll put some accent beams right there at the end. Like those, and then I know that there is a cost with it, but eaves, not like 12-foot eaves, but like a 2-foot eave. I think that's just good for one, the looks, but two, just the durability and the maintenance of it, because it gets the water off your walls.
That goes back to some of the biggest things with a barndominium that people need to watch out for a little bit is like those accent pieces. You can tell if you're talking to somebody who builds barns or metal buildings or whatever, and then you can tell if you're talking to someone that is a contractor that's building barndominiums, and they're going to be your higher cost people, because they'll say a porch as where a barndominium guy, or not a barndominium, but a guy that just builds metal buildings, he's going to call that a shed.
Yeah.
And you're just going to happen to extend your concrete a little bit farther, and now you have a porch, and then you just wrap those posts in cedar and boom, you're done.
Boom. Yeah, exactly.
So, and then same thing with, like you talked about eaves. That's one of the things that I talked to 3 metal building builders here in the state of Oklahoma. We were going to end up going with post frame. We weren't even going to do the steel structure just because the cost of steel at the time, at the beginning of the pandemic was, and then wood followed shortly after. And then, but the eaves, he said to me verbatim, I have never put windows into a metal building that at least one of them didn't leak.
Yeah.
And he said, it's the nature of the structure. You've got siding that's running vertically into a J channel. And he said, you're just asking for something to happen. And so he goes, if I'm building this building and your intent is to put living structure inside of it, that you care, like you've got drywall or whatever wall substrate that you're using to put on top of your studs, whatever that is, he said, if that's doesn't need to get wet, I put all of my windows under either a shed or porch, or I put it under at least a 2.5-foot eave. So like on your gables, he would say you're going to want to extend those. And he actually recommends not to put windows on the gables at all.
Really?
He said, if you put windows on gables, he said, you're asking for leaks. And, and he's like, I've sealed it with silicone, with spray foam, with, zip tape, which if you know what zip tape is, that stuff is like take the skin off your arm tape.
Yeah.
And so he said, even if you put them on the gables, they come back, and he can make little, like the little box. I don't know the technical term for it, but it's just the little tiny window roof line thing that causes the water to shed off of it. But that was his big deal. Was he was like, I don't recommend putting windows anywhere that they're not covered, just because of the nature of the structure.
Yeah, and for those of you who aren't super familiar with this, part of the reason that that's a challenge is because these metal panels that you do, they're not flat. They have ribs or bump outs or things like that. So they're textured, and making your flashings and things like that can be particularly tricky.
Yeah.
And initially these were barns, right? Like you just had, they weren't initially meant to be homes. So flashing windows and other like openings, penetrations like that can be tricky for sure.
Sure. Yeah, it is a big deal to have, like you said, those seams that you think are just, I mean, they're literally like 2 knuckles width that cross over each other, and they're running like this. They're running vertically. I mean, it's just asking for water.
Yeah.
So like you said, these were barns. It doesn't matter. Water, okay, great. There's a little humidity for all we care,
So let's kind of, we talked a little bit about it, but why would someone consider doing this over a traditional house, right? Because we're talking about some of the challenges here. Why would I consider something like this?
Yeah. Barndominiums, or a barn house, or whatever you want to call it. Like I said earlier, it's designed strictly to be utilitarian. You're wanting to combine 2 spaces. You've got 2 needs. You need a place to live. You need a place to store stuff that's big, open, shop-like, maybe a concrete floor, maybe not. I've seen barndominiums where they did concrete and only half, and the other half literally like a dirt floor barn. But you've got 2 needs that you need to meet. That is the person that needs a barndominium. One of the biggest questions that we got on our channel is because I came out with these so you want to build a barndominium videos, and we went through budgeting, and we went through should you do this in the first place, and I just filmed today the part 3, which was addressing the question we got most, which was, hey, I thought you were building a barndominium. You had these videos with a barndominium, and you talked about it a lot, but we ended up not doing a barndominium. We ended up going traditional build for the reasons that a barndominium is designed to meet a utilitarian need. And what we had done when we designed it is our first design was for a 30 by 75 square or rectangle, and 3/4 of it was full of house. But slowly we started redesigning, and it just kept creeping further and further over to where our entire barn was full of minium. And so we didn't have more room. And at that point, we were building a house that served, like we had a barn, and then 6 inches inside of that barn was a house. And so at that point, we're building a house for $110, $115 a square foot, which with a barndominium, that's crazy. Like you shouldn't be spending that much on a rectangular shaped barndominium. And it's because your living quarters are only partial. If you are building out a barndominium fully, you're building a house. I'm sorry, but you're just building a house. You're building a house with a barn look, with metal siding. But if you have that need of having utilitarian, barndominiums are fantastic. My brother built a barndominium literally across this field from me over here. So he's a good BB gun shot away, which I say that with a good reason. If he ever makes me mad, I'm just going to wait till he's out and, give him a little sting, just perfect distance. But he built a barndominium. He built the same size shop that I have. I have a 30 by 50 shop, so 1,500 square foot shop. He enclosed 2/3 of it. So he's got about a 900-ish square foot living area, and then a garage, like a 2-car garage, essentially with 12-foot ceilings.
Okay.
And for him, it made a ton of sense because he wanted to have this little area, and they're planning on building a stick-built house or a barndominium or something in 2 to 5 years. But they have this little studio apartment essentially that they are living in, and it's one big open living room that they'll have their bed, their kitchen, their living space, their, all the things that they need. And then they have a daughter, and so she's got like this little 8x8 corner room, and then they have like an 8x8 closet, and then they have like a 10x8 bathroom, and so that's their whole house. And they were going as far as like not even finishing the floor. We ended up talking them into going and getting like a vinyl floor like we have in our house, because we're like, you're gonna hate that. It's gonna soak in, because where we live, the dirt is not dirt, it's red clay. And it stains everything. So you can imagine like 1 week worth of walking from outside to inside and that unstained concrete. You just be like seeing pathways. But he built his barndominium. I think he was around $60 a foot for building his barndominium, which is great. And it all determines on what levels of finishing you're putting in to whatever you're doing. Because I mean, you can build a 500 square foot house and spend $500,000 on it if you really wanted to, depending upon what you wanted to put in it. But barndominiums, to go back just to answer the question, this is a really long version of it, but all it is are you needing to meet that utilitarian need of having a barn and a condominium? Are you needing that duplicate space? If you're not, you're kind of wasting money on building it.
Yeah. Well, and then in today's world with lumber prices as it is, like it gets to be, we were talking about this before, like you have to start to like crunch the numbers and game out both scenarios here, right? Because lumber you could switch to metal studs, you could have a more open floor plan, there's a lot of things to consider here when it comes to it. But, it sounds like what your brother's doing was very similar to what I was going to do. I was basically going to build this thing, have a big shop, a very small, like efficiency apartment, basically, as a landing pad to live in while I built my big stick built house on the property. And that was going to be kind of like the thing to carry me over. And then I would have a nice shop, and then maybe like a guest bedroom, where I don't know what I would do with it after, really, storage or rent it out or something like that. Let's talk a little bit about what your journey. You started at Barndominium, you realized, hey, like maybe we need to reevaluate, and what'd you end up with? So take us through that.
So we started with Barndominium. I was all in barndominium, full on. I was like, man, we're gonna build this barndominium for $40 a foot. Just stupid, just real ignorant. And all of that comes with a lot of just research, figuring out exactly what things were going to cost. Just that building alone. Just this building alone that we're sitting in now was around $35,000. That's insulation, concrete floor, all that stuff. And that's a really good deal for a metal shop building with wainscoting, a full size 12-foot by 12-foot garage door, 2 man doors, a back shed. It's a big structure, and it's $35,000. But if I would have immediately turned around and filled that entire structure with wood, then it would have, I just paid $35,000 for siding. That's the way you really have to think about it, is siding, which we did siding on our entire house for around $12,000. So there's a big difference. Keep in mind, I bought my lumber pack right before the lumber went crazy. I squeaked it in like a week before. But we went from Barndominium. We were full in. I was full in. My wife, Casey, was about like 85% in, because she was really heavy in that camp of like, I think barndominiums look like trash and I don't like them. And I'm like, I'm not disagreeing, but look at the cost. It's $40 a foot. And then we do the math, right? You figure out the cost of the structure, how tall the window, how tall your walls you want to be. Do you want a second story? Do you want a storage loft? You start adding all these little things in, and you start going through, you calling contractors, you're calling subcontractors, you're calling lumber yards, you're calling window suppliers, you're calling all of these places. And you end up coming down to it to like what happened with us. We looked up and I said, you know what? Because the number one thing I tell anybody that's asked me a question about making their initial budget is make your budget and then add a subline at the bottom that takes the total of your budget and multiply it by 20% and add that to the total, because you're going to use it. And that exact thing happened to us. I mean, almost to the T. But when we found out, hey, we're going to be building this barndominium that I wanted to save cost on, that I wanted to be under $80 a foot, which was my goal, was be under $80 a foot. We were going to be in the 100, 110, 120 range because of the finishing that we were wanting to put in the house. Because this is our forever home. We weren't building a transitional home like what my brother's building or what you're talking about building. Like, you're just like, I need something to get into. I want to live in it for a couple years, save up, pay cash for my house, all that kind of stuff. Like, there's a big difference in what you're wanting. Like, we were wanting the house that I want to be buried out in the backyard eventually. Like, that's our place. And so our finishings weren't, cheap stuff. Like, we went with granite countertops. We had a lot of nice light fixtures. We put in a nice floor. We got cabinets that are solid wood, or not solid wood, but they're at least very minimum plywood. So a lot of things that were nicer features. And so when you add up all those costs, and I thought, okay, and it came down to, at the end of the day, we were spending a lot more money on basically siding the house and roofing the house. We could have saved all of that money by just skipping that last step, putting smart siding on, and we have the same exact house, because our house is a rectangle. It's no different than the barndominium as far as, shape. It is a rectangle, and then the back corner of it has a porch cut out of it, an exterior porch with a gable, and the front extends an extra 10 feet. And our trusses, which is the biggest thing that saved us a lot of money, was using trussing instead of, a traditional 2x6 or 2x8 built, roof. That saved us a lot of money and also saved a lot of time. But those things all factor into add up, and we ended up building our house and this shop for around $85 a foot. So it was a massive savings when it came down to just cost. Because at the end of the day, if you can get what you want for cheaper, then why wouldn't you do that? I mean, if you're just really hung up on wanting a barndominium, you got to be really hung up on the barndominium to spend an extra $20 a foot when you're talking about a 3,000 square foot barndominium, which is what we were looking at. I mean, you do the math.
Yeah. And I think, it's different, different people will have different thoughts on this. And I think the advantages that I've seen with like the barndominiums, one is, I suppose you could just side your house in metal.
You
for
could.
The lower maintenance. Depending on the dimensions of your house, like there's a point when the spans get so big that you're gonna have to start to look at metal anyway. I don't know what that number is, but even with trusses,
it gets pretty big. Trusses, for example, I thought the same thing. I thought the same exact thing. It's like, hey, I can only go like 40 feet wide with the truss. When we had our trusses delivered, which is a really cool video, because I didn't know how they delivered them. I didn't know if they have a crane that's attached to the truck.
Nope.
Nope. It's just like, all right, you out of the way, click, and then it just
rolls off. Yeah.
And you could feel it hit the ground, like the ground shakes. It was super cool. You can't translate into that to a video, but that was probably my favorite thing that we did on the entire thing, was getting the trusses dropped off the truck. But I asked the guy, I said, hey, what's, because I felt like our trusses were gigantic. Our trusses were 65 feet.
Wow.
I thought they were ginormous. And I said, what's the biggest truss? Is this like the biggest trusses you built? And he was like, oh no. I was like, what? It's like they're building trusses that are 82, 83 feet long.
Wow.
Like the max that they can get to transport on the road. And he said, it's not a matter of, it's the variables to consider aren't the wood. I mean, the wood's strong, especially when we're building it this way with a series of triangles and the truss, and even my trusses have a big 10 by 10 square right in the middle of them. So because I framed up a big attic.
Truss.
Yeah, big attic truss.
Okay.
And I thought those would make things considerably weaker, but I mean, they've got everything down to a T. And so the trussing whole, like the whole width of the trussing thing, I thought that was a big factor. Not at all a factor. It was, they were building these. I mean, I want to see one of these other trusses because they're building 3-to-1 pitch trusses that are 80 feet long. And I don't know how they're doing it, but they're doing it.
Yeah. Interesting.
It's really crazy.
All right. So, you mentioned that you guys had chose some, nicer finishes, right?
Yeah.
What do you think the swing would be here if someone went from not necessarily budget, but more like middle of the road, right? Like, what kind of decisions would you make different if you were trying to get that price point down lower?
If you were trying to get the price point down lower, I mean, we as good as some of the finishes that we do have, I mean, they're still relatively inexpensive. Like if you looked at our cabinets, you would think that our cabinets were really expensive. But we ordered ready to assemble cabinets, and I had them all flat packed and shipped to us.
Yes.
And essentially it was I just played Legos for like a week and put all of these cabinets together. And then I also I've done a lot of trim carpentry, not a lot. I've done some trim carpentry stuff and woodwork stuff before. So I have that background to know how to install cabinets, level cabinets, all of that stuff. So we saved a ton of money. The number one way to save money on any build, I don't care what kind of build it is if you do it yourself. That's the number one way. But immediately following that, when you're talking about finishes, I mean, we could have saved a lot of money by doing different kind of countertops. Like we could have easily, I was really all in on going and getting a Formica style countertop because I had done a lot of research on just what different finishes they had. And I found a finish that looked identical to what we have. We have quartz countertops in all of our bathrooms. So we have 2 bathrooms and a laundry room that has quartz countertop in there. And then in the living area, like our kitchen, we have granite countertops. And I found stuff that looked almost identical to it, but it was all just Formica. And I could have installed it myself. Like, again, like that's the number one thing to save the money is like, can I install it myself? Yes. Okay. Materials at that point, we could get a little bit of nicer material because the finished Formica countertop that we were looking at was one of their premium finishes, but I'm cutting out, $10 a foot install cost by doing it myself. But that's a lot of the ways that you can do that is by looking at what can I do myself. Countertops was a big one. Flooring is the fastest way to spend a ton of money. Especially when you're talking about doing it throughout the entire house. We went with a click together. They call it rigid core. And it was kind of I didn't want something that was like $1 a foot because I have 3 kids and they're savages and they will tear everything to smithereens. There's that key factor. But then I also didn't want to spend $4 a foot. It can get crazy. You're like, $4, but times it by 3,000. You go crazy. We ended up getting a rigid core that was on sale, that was going out of style. That was the last shipment from a warehouse in Dallas. So that took 2.5 weeks of research to find that floor, to be able to get that floor to make it cost effective. And we spent about $2.15 a foot on flooring that should have been about a $4 a foot flooring. So that floor is going to last us for 20 years. It'll be a really nice floor. It's waterproof. It's scratch proof. It's actually self-healing. It's really weird.
Yeah.
I scratched it when we were installing stuff, and I like threw a fit because I was so mad at myself. And then the next day I couldn't find the scratch. It
Oh
was
wow.
bizarre. It was really bizarre. So if you see self-healing floor, like, it's real. It sounds
Yeah.
stupid, but it's real. So there's a lot of really good ways. Countertops is an easy way to save money. Flooring is an easy way to save money. Do-it-yourself cabinets, major way to save money.
Yeah.
Lighting. I bought
Mhm.
almost every light fixture we have in our house off of Amazon.
Okay.
Uh, Installed all of them ourselves.
Okay.
So our lighting fixtures look really expensive. They
Mhm.
were relatively inexpensive, and it didn't cost anything to put them in.
Right.
And then the last thing I would say is just all of your doorknobs and hardware.
Mhm.
Again, you can get those cheap at a lot of places, and if you're at all remotely handy, you can put them in yourself. The
Yeah.
other biggest way to save money, which I didn't do and should have done, was painting. Didn't paint
Okay.
the house myself. Could have saved a lot of money. I mean, our house was about $14,000 to paint. Um,
Wow.
our painters,
Is
our
that
painters
inside
ended
and
up,
out?
that is in and out, because we've
Okay.
got
Gotcha.
siding that needs to be painted. So there's that. But sorry about that. So we have that stuff that we have to get painted. Our painters ended up kind of screwing some stuff up, and they ended up suing us, and there's a whole video on that. Um,
Okay.
that's a long story that I don't have time for, but that was the main reason I should have painted it myself, because I wouldn't have had to deal with that. But yeah,
Right.
it was a lot of, there's a ton of ways to save money, and every one of them starts with, can you do it yourself?
Yeah. And I tell with tiny houses, like people always gawk at like the prices that some people pay. I'm like, well, 50% of that, sometimes 60%, depending on the builder, is labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they have to pay their staff, they have to have insurance, the tools, and all that kind of the overhead and everything like that, plus make a profit.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, you basically can take the cost of a home, chop it in half just
Mm-hmm.
by doing it yourself. And I think an important step in that is purchasing some land in a county that allows,
Yeah.
it's an owner builder kind of setup. So I assume that
Yeah.
was the kind of the
It was
scenario
something I was
you were
really
in.
nervous about, because you have to know all your codes. Like, you can't just go do things
Yeah.
willy nilly. You can, but you better hope you get away with it. And you may not get away with it once you try to sell it. If you ever try to sell it and they do an inspection and they figure out all this other stuff, then you got
Yeah.
fines and all that. We built in Lincoln County in Oklahoma, where I had literally one thing I had to do, and it was get a flood inspection. Everything else I could do myself.
Okay.
Everything from, I didn't have to
Yeah.
have a licensed plumber. I didn't have to have a licensed anything. I did. I did have a licensed plumber, and one of my good friends is an electrician, who helped walk me through all the electric, doing it myself.
Okay.
And so there's that is a major key factor in understanding exactly what you can and can't do, because if you do something wrong, it's tickets, and that doesn't necessarily have a subline in the budget. paying the county. So
Yeah.
it's something that's definitely you should work with, and it's easy just to call the county clerk or the county whatever, call the county office and just say, hey, I'm building a house, who should I talk to? And they'll tell you. And it's not as daunting as it
Yeah.
sounds. In some
Mhm.
places, like in Oklahoma City, for example, they've got a department and they have a handbook, and they just give you the handbook, and you can look at it and see what things you need, what you don't have, what you need
Yeah.
to hire out, what you have to have licensed, all of that stuff. Because if you don't do that, and like I said, someone rolls up on you, they'll just get out their ticket book and just go to town.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so where my tiny house is in a big city, and where my property is in the
Mm-hmm.
rural mountains, right? And the difference between trying to work with the city, like code enforcement, and the rural is it's night and day. Like it is so pleasant to call up the local code enforcement people in the mountain town. In a city, it's like you need an act of Congress to get someone on the phone, and then they're like, "It's not my job," and just hang up on you. It's incredible.
It's nuts.
It's so awful. And
Yeah.
I've just had for the tiny house and then other projects I've done with some commercial stuff. It's a nightmare to work with the cities on that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think if you do have some skills, if you do have like connections, like you're saying, an electrician friend or something like that, that can be really helpful just to kind of get you over the hurdles. And it's not an all or nothing. In some cases, you can hire, and I tell the people all this, you can hire an electrician to do the heavy lifting, and then you wire all the outlets, right? Or you run the wires. In my case, I had him, the electrician, do my breaker box, and then I ran everything, and then he just walked behind me and checked it, and I paid him like $200 to do the check, and then we were all good. So yeah, it's figure it out. Do as much as you can. You can save a ton of money for sure.
Yes, and having good friends in good places makes all the difference. Like you said, getting to introduce people, like even if you don't know an electrician and you have a friend that does, call them and say, "Hey, I'm going to build a house. Can I take you and buy you lunch?"
Yeah,
and go make a friend that's an electrician.
Because it's worth it.
You will benefit, and one lunch meeting with a guy will let you know whether or not they're an idiot or not. Because there's a lot of things that I wish I would have gone to one lunch meeting with a few of the contractors that we ended up using, because I would have known a lot more having spent some more time with them and see kind of what things they were good at, what they did do, follow up on their previous jobs. The number one recommendation I can give to anybody else is any contractor that you get needs to come with at least 3 references.
Yeah.
Because I didn't do that. And we kind of got a little bit burned on our concrete, our slab stuff, our porches. They did a relatively good job on our actual slab, but our back porch actually slopes into our house.
Oh, wow.
There's nothing I can do about it outside of either installing French drains in the concrete or ripping it out and trying it again. And I can't get them to call me back, and I can't get them on the phone. And so there's each reference you get with anything needs to come, or each subcontractor that you hire needs to come with at least 3 references, or just needs to be a friend that you trust.
Yeah, that's one trick I've learned in I think most places. You can find on the county website, you can pull by their name or like their ID number or something like that, all the permits that they pulled. And you can one, if they're pulling permits, right? Like I've talked to contractors like, "Oh, we don't actually pull permits," or something like that. That's
okay. Bye.
Yeah. I mean, or not. Like that could be exactly who you want, right? Like, but you should know what you're getting into. And then you can also often see if there's like people who have had their license revoked and then reinstated and things like that. And that, those are some red flags. So yeah, in addition to checking references, making sure you have a contract, making sure like where to find them if they, hopefully they have like an office or something like that. And then checking the records for fines and revocations of their license and things like that, making sure they actually have a license. Befriending some of the inspectors, because you'll be like, "Oh yeah, I was talking with Joe," and then the guy will give you like this hard side glance. He's like, "Joe? Yeah." He's like, "Oh." He's like, "I can't say anything, but okay." And then you're like, "Nope, not doing Joe." So like those inspectors know what's up, right? Like,
they do.
Because the inspectors the people that did my septic, like the guy was, the inspector was like, "Oh yeah." He's like, "I've never had a call back on any one of these guys. And these guys put in 4 septics a week." for the last 10 years. So it's like, okay, you start to hear those kinds of things, and then it gives you a little bit more confidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So look, if we could talk a little bit about your brother's build a little bit, could you,
Mm-hmm.
you said that it was like it had a smaller living area and it had an open area.
Mm-hmm.
Like, was that really the main driver why he chose to go with a traditional barndominium style?
The main driver for him with going with the barndominium style was because he wanted a transition. He needed a stepping stone, and a inexpensive stepping stone that he can eventually, because the way he did his is his barndominiums is oriented this way, and he put a wall that separates the two. And so when he builds his house, he's going to knock down the wall, and
Gotcha.
he will have a full-size shop with, a little office room. That's what's currently his daughter's room. Like, he'll have a little office.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He'll have a closet, storage, whatever you'd want to call it. And then he'll have a plumbed bathroom in his shop. And so that is the intent of that building, is that building will be a shop building eventually. Mm-hmm. Currently, it's a house, barndominium, and then it's going to allow him to save a lot of money by building his house on the grounds. Mm-hmm. And he can build it throughout the weekends over the course of 2 years if he wanted to. Buying lumber when it's cheapest, buying other materials when it's cheapest, getting laborers in the off season. Instead of hiring, you'd be surprised at how much the rates of contractors will change depending upon the season.
Absolutely.
If they're slow or fast, or if they're too busy, that stuff all changes. And framers, they love to frame in the spring and the fall when it's cooler. They charge you more when you do it in July.
Yeah.
It's because it's horrible. But anyway, that was his intent, was that it was just temporary. It's not designed to be their forever house. And it meets, like I said, it meets two needs. They've got horses, and so they need that little shop area to be able to store feed and tools, and my sister-in-law's vehicle, because in Oklahoma we have tornadoes and hail, and they don't like outside. So they went with what met their needs, and ultimately that's what we did too. We went with what met our needs. We wanted our forever home, and this is what served it best and made us economical. It made it to where we got pretty much everything that we wanted in the house. That changes every day. Once you build a house, you're like, oh, I wish I would have. Like, oh, but I didn't, because it costs so much money to do that.
Right.
But that was ultimately the reason he went and did that.
Okay. Speaking of like things you would change, hindsight being 2020, you could do it all over again. Anything you would change about your build, or maybe any lessons from his build?
Things that I would change. My number one thing is that easily the number one thing is that all subcontractors would have come with 3 references. That I cannot stress that one enough. Number 2, which is probably more like 1.99, like it's basically also number 1, is you get what you pay for.
Yeah.
You get what you pay for. I hate saying that because I am a deal guy. And so for some reason, I'm gravitationally pulled to the deal, even if it's maybe not as good, but it's a deal. And I'm like a cocaine addict for deals. So I see deal and I'm like, ugh, and I start getting the itch, and it's bad. So that was the case with the paint. For example, like the paint budget the painter that we went with had a $12,000 bid. We went with him. Our next highest bid was $14,000, and he had lots of great references and everything else. And in fact, I had one guy tell me not to use the company that we went with, but I know better, and ended up paying for it. It bit me. And there's other things that along the way that we paid for that were cheap. and they're already starting to kind of wear out, and it's only been 6 months. So you get what you pay for. As much as it hurts me to say that, like, you have to take into consideration some things. Like, some things are okay to get cheap.
Yeah.
Like our flooring, for example. I learned my lesson. I paid for something that was going to be more expensive. We got a great deal on it, so I met both criteria.
Right.
I was a happy addict that day, but we were able to check both of those boxes.
Right.
At the end of the day, you have to be able to understand that you will get what you pay for, unless you're just kind of getting that perfect storm situation.
Right. Yeah.
The only other hindsight thing that I really have, that I think that I have, because I love our house. I love the way it's built. I love the look. Everything about it was awesome. The only other thing is not to get in over your head, because that's a big one. Or not to get over your head, because I was over my head the whole time. It's not getting over your head. It's, if there's not a timeline, don't make one that's unrealistic.
Okay.
I would find myself stressed out throughout the entire build. Not entire, but through a lot of the build, I'd find myself just stressed to the max. And I remember multiple times sitting down with my wife, and she says, like, why are you acting like this? Why are you so stressed out? And I'm like, well, this got to get done, and this has got to get done, and this got to get done, and this got to get done. And she's like, why?
Yeah.
And I never asked myself that question up until that point. Like, well, I don't know. Because I'm a contractor, dang it. And I've got a schedule to keep that makes no sense. So if there's not like a hard out, if there's not a deadline, don't make something that's going to kill you or cause you to spend less time with your family, or cause you to miss things that you're not going to look back 20 years from now and think, oh, I'm glad I got that floor installed. You're going to look back and think, oh, I'm glad I got to go play catch with my son that day. Or I'm glad I got to go do whatever, go to church, go to a family event, go to whatever it is that you could have missed because of something that didn't need a deadline, like you were expounding upon yourself. That's the number 1, 2, and 3. And 3s, they're all probably 1, 1, and 1. It's really what they are. My brother, he's talked before about the same thing, just about deadlines, because like he didn't do the same finishes. He's had a lot more patience than I have, especially with like his water well. He's been waiting on water for his well to be drilled forever. Like his house, in fact, his barndominium's done. Like it's right there, ready to be moved in, and all he lacks is a well. And he could go with a different contractor. He could go with somebody he would have to pay full price for, but he's getting a really, really good deal because, as weird as it sounds, I'm actually Native American. I know I don't look like a Native American. It's like the redheadedest, whitest Indian you've ever seen in your entire life. But we're both Native American, and he is getting a great deal through Indian Services by helping him come to pay for this well. And I was like, I am not waiting that long. I'm out. Like I got things to do. I paid for it. He's been patient, and it's about to pay off because they're about to schedule him. And so he's had a lot more patience than I have. I also have a kid I was trying to get into school because we were about to go nuts doing virtual school. I was about to lose my mind. But anyway, those are probably the biggest ones, I would say, with hindsight.
And that makes a lot of sense. And the scheduling thing it's incredible how wrong you're going to be about your schedule. Like with my tiny house, I was like, oh, I'm going to build this in 6 months or 7 months, 8 months, something like that. Year and a half later, I moved into it. And I felt like I was killing myself the whole time. I mean, especially if you're working with like contractors and subcontractors, especially these days, like in a hot market, like they have more work. You are not the priority, unfortunately.
No, you're not.
That's super frustrating to, people, because it's like, well, like I should be, or I'm paying to be, or whatever the thing is. And which is not the reality of it. It's always going to take longer. You could pretty much just start out saying, take your best guess and double it.
I was going to say, my favorite saying with this is double it. Everything.
Yeah.
Double it.
Maybe not your favorite, because
your budget,
the budget,
your timeline, double it.
One thing that I learned, like, was
all of it.
The ordering schedule, right? Like when the lead times for things, how long it's going to take to show up, and you don't want it sitting around outside. You want it to get up, you want it to get dried in, you want it out of the elements, but you also don't want to be like, we need our windows. Oh, well, they're not going to be here for a month. That happened to me.
Yeah.
Like I had a window, I ordered all my windows on time. One came in totally smashed. It was a custom thing. 60 days later, I got the replacement, and there was nothing I could do. I mean, it was also summer, so I was kind of glad to not be working because it was so god awful hot out.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, it's always going to take a lot longer. And so like one thing that I tell people is, if you can, don't because some people have to sell their house to be able to afford to move into these things, or they have some other time constraint, right? So if you're able to build this while you have a place to live, and then sell it or rent until then or something like that, that really helped me. I rented
for a year like we did.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Which was great.
My landlord, I went for a year, and then I did month to month with her with a 60-day notice, and she was totally fine with that. And that helped me so much, because by the time I was able to give my 60-day notice, I was pretty much done. I was able to walk in and just kind of relax. So that was really nice. So if you can plan it that way, then the schedule isn't as stressful. So when the electrician doesn't show up for 2 weeks and doesn't call you back, and then you realize you have to get a new one, or the thing's late, or the well guy doesn't show up for a month or whatever, or the next inspection date is like 6 months from now or something, there's all sorts of crazy things for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. I guess, so we're coming up on our time here. Is there anything else that you think people should know about this if they're going to consider doing this for themselves?
The one thing that I've like to tell people is that, like, it goes along with that whole double it thing.
Yeah.
It's going to take more time than you think. It's going to cost more money than you think. It's going to cause more stress on you in your marriage and your family dynamics than you think. And you have to be prepared for that. Whatever that is. For me, it's my faith. For others, it's, I don't know what, but that's what it's been for me. You have to have that backbone that's going to drive you through the rest of it. Because if you don't have that, I mean, there's so many stories. When we went to like our abstract company to do our closing, that we heard 3 stories about people that they signed divorce papers a month before, and then were signing papers on the house to close on it so they could then split it up. Just lots of stories like that. It's going to take a lot, and it's something that doesn't need to be done lightly. It's the coolest thing I've ever done. It was the most stressful thing I've ever done. It's the most expensive thing I've ever done. It's got a lot of titles in most. But at the core of it, I was always remembering why. Because the why is what drives you through all of those things. Having that goal at the end of knowing, hey, I want to do this. As I sit here and look out my window and I've got deer in my front yard. Like, this is one of the reasons why I did it. I did it because I wanted my kids to know what it was like to grow up in this kind of environment in a small town, to be able to go to school, know everybody there, to be able to hunt, fish, learn how to live off the land, to have a garden, to experience this kind of life. This is what the goal of what we wanted. I want to live and I want to die in this house. Like all of those things drive you through to the end of whatever that is. And so whether it's, I want to live and die in this house, or if it's my brother who's like, I want to have something that I can live in for 2 years, and we are going to build this for the bottom dollar so I can make my house even greater. That's the end goal for him. That can help drive him through. Like having that kind of stuff helps drive you through that series of mosts, of the most stressful, most expensive, most whatever, because at the end of the day, if you get all those mosts become worth it, when at the end of the day, you've met that thing that was your most, your goal. So having that, I didn't have that really grasped at the very beginning of our process. Having that going into it is hugely beneficial. I thought I grasped it, but I didn't. So like with all of the things, well, if you think you grasp it now, double it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end off. I want to say thank you for taking the time, and will you let people know where they can find you if they want to connect with you and learn more?
You can find me just about anywhere. Hurley Films, HearleyFilms. We have a YouTube channel, like I said at the beginning. It's pretty much the thing that I most consistently post content on. I'm a really bad Facebooker. I'm even a worse Twitterer, and I don't even remember what my login for Instagram most of the time. But I'm on all those things, and I do post on them every now and then. But I just love making videos and movies. Like I said, like this is what movies and videos, what I do for a living. So I find the most identity in that. That's my lane, and I like to stay in that lane because spending too much time on Facebook makes me angry.
Awesome. Well, Adam, thank you again. And I think we'll leave it there. So everyone, thanks for stopping by and watching. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys next time.
Thank you.